Between 1975 and 1979, the Khmer Rouge killed somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people, in a country of approximately 8 million. That is 1 in 4 Cambodians dead in less than 4 years, from execution, forced labor, starvation, and disease, inside a regime that declared itself Year Zero and attempted to erase everything that had existed before it. Women were not peripheral to this. They were targeted specifically, as wives, as mothers, as educated professionals, as ethnic minorities, as anyone whose body, labor, or reproductive capacity the regime decided it had the right to control. Forced marriages were performed in mass ceremonies, where couples who had never met were ordered to wed under penalty of execution. Women who refused were killed. Women who showed emotion during the ceremony were reported as insufficiently loyal to Angkar. The extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, the tribunal established to prosecute senior Khmer Rouge leaders, did not classify forced marriage as a crime against humanity until 2016, 41 years after it began. The women who survived it are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s now, and Cambodia is still trying to decide what to do with the generation that carried out these orders, many of whom returned to ordinary civilian life after 1979 and have lived in the same villages as their victims ever since. Cambodia in 1960 was a country of temples, rice fields, and a royal tradition stretching back centuries. It had gained independence from France in 1953 under King Norodom Sihanouk, a monarch who governed with genuine popular support and navigated the Cold War with a policy of studied neutrality. Phnom Penh was a functioning capital city, with universities, hospitals, markets, and a professional class that included significant numbers of educated women in medicine, law, teaching, and government. Women in Cambodia at that time lived within a traditional framework that placed significant cultural weight on feminine modesty, deference, and domestic responsibility. But the urban professional class had expanded access to education and employment in ways that were gradually shifting those boundaries. That trajectory ended in 1970. A military coup led by General Lon Nol, supported by the United States, which was fighting the Vietnam War across Cambodia's eastern border, removed Sihanouk from power. What followed was 5 years of civil war between the Lon Nol government and the Khmer Rouge, a radical communist insurgency that had been growing in the Cambodian countryside since the 1960s. The United States bombed Cambodia extensively between 1969 and 1973 in an attempt to destroy North Vietnamese supply routes running through Cambodian territory. Estimates suggest that American bombing killed between 50,000 and 150,000 Cambodian civilians and drove hundreds of thousands of rural people toward the Khmer Rouge, whose recruiters told them the bombs were coming from the cities and that the cities were the enemy. By 1975, the Khmer Rouge controlled most of the Cambodian countryside. On April 17, 1975, their forces entered Phnom Penh. The Lon Nol government collapsed without a final battle. The soldiers who marched into the capital were mostly teenagers, some younger, in black uniforms and rubber sandals cut from tires. They carried rifles and a set of instructions that their leadership called the most radical social transformation in human history. What they did with those instructions, to the entire population of Cambodia, and to its women specifically, was documented in the testimony of survivors, in the records of the tribunal that followed decades later, and in the mass graves that forensic teams are still excavating today. The evacuation of Phnom Penh began within hours of the Khmer Rouge entering the city. Loudspeakers mounted on vehicles moved through the streets, broadcasting a single message: "Everyone must leave immediately. The Americans are going to bomb the city. It is for your safety. You will return in 3 days." Neither statement was true. The city of approximately 2 million people, swollen with refugees who had fled the fighting in the countryside, was emptied in a single day. Hospitals were cleared. Patients were carried into the streets on their beds. Surgeries in progress were stopped. Doctors, nurses, and patients were told to walk. Families moved in columns along the roads leading out of the capital, carrying whatever they had managed to grab in the minutes between the announcement and the soldiers arriving at their doors. Many carried almost nothing. The Khmer Rouge had a framework for categorizing the population they were now controlling. Old people, peasants and rural poor who had lived under Khmer Rouge authority before the fall of Phnom Penh were considered base people, reliable, ideologically sound by virtue of their class origin. New people, urban residents, educated professionals, government workers, military personnel, ethnic minorities, and anyone else who had lived under the Lon Nol government were considered enemies of the revolution by definition. Their class origin made them suspect, regardless of their individual beliefs or actions. For women in the new people category, this classification carried immediate and specific consequences. Educated women, teachers, doctors, lawyers, civil servants, were identified as class enemies. Those whose professions were discovered were executed. Survivors learned quickly that certain answers to certain questions were fatal. Speaking French, wearing glasses, having soft hands that had never worked rice fields. Each detail was a potential death sentence. Women with connections to the Lon Nol military, wives, daughters, sisters of soldiers, were targeted specifically. In the first weeks after the evacuation, many were identified and killed alongside their male relatives. The regime established a network of cooperatives, agricultural work camps, distributed across the country, where the evacuated population was sent to work. Families were deliberately separated. Husbands were taken to different cooperatives from wives. Children were separated from parents and placed in youth organizations where they were taught that Angkar, the organization, the faceless collective authority of the Khmer Rouge, was their only family. A generation of Cambodian children were taught to report their parents. Some did. The parents who were reported did not come back, and the women who watched this happen, who understood within the first weeks what the regime they were now living under was actually built to do, had to make a calculation that no person should ever have to make. How much of yourself do you erase to survive? For most of them, the answer changed every single day. The Khmer Rouge's vision for Cambodia required the transformation of the entire country into an agrarian collective. Cities were emptied. Currency was abolished. Schools were closed. Hospitals were closed. Religion was suppressed. Buddhist monks, who had occupied a central role in Cambodian cultural and spiritual life for centuries, were forced to disrobe, were sent to work camps, and were in many cases executed. The calendar was reset to year zero. The past, all of it, was declared finished. Women were required to work. In the cooperatives, labor assignments made no distinction based on physical capacity, age, or health. Women worked rice fields, built irrigation canals, carried earth in baskets on their heads, and cleared jungle, alongside men, alongside elderly people, alongside children, from before sunrise to after sunset, with breaks that survivor testimony consistently describes as insufficient and unpredictable. Food was controlled centrally and distributed by cooperative leadership. The rations provided were deliberately inadequate. Survivors describe receiving small amounts of rice gruel, sometimes little more than rice water, that could not sustain the level of physical labor required. People grew visibly weaker over months. Women who had been healthy urban professionals in April 1975 were, by 1977, severely malnourished. Foraging for additional food, picking fruit, catching fish, gathering plants, was prohibited and punishable by execution. Eating without permission was theft from Angkar. People were executed for this. Women who became pregnant in the cooperatives faced conditions that made pregnancy catastrophically dangerous. Medical care did not exist in any meaningful form. Traditional birth attendants, if any were present in the cooperative, operated without supplies. Women died in childbirth from complications that would have been routine in any functioning medical system. Infants born in the cooperatives were malnourished from birth. The regime's attitude toward the family unit was one of deliberate dissolution. Private emotional bonds between husband and wife, between parent and child, were framed as bourgeois attachments that weakened loyalty to Angkar. Public displays of affection were prohibited. Private conversation between spouses was monitored, and in some documented cases reported by informants within the cooperative. Women who displayed grief for a dead child, for a missing husband, for a relative who had been taken away, were considered ideologically suspect. Grief implied attachment to the old world. Attachment to the old world implied resistance to the revolution. The psychological architecture of this was precise. It was not incidental cruelty. It was a system designed to produce a population that had no loyalty, no identity, and no emotional resource outside its relationship with Angkar. Women resisted this in ways that were necessarily invisible. They memorized the names of their children in case they were separated. They hid small objects, photographs, pieces of clothing, that connected them to their lives before April 1975. They developed networks of trust with other women in their cooperatives that allowed the sharing of food, information, and the kind of human contact the regime was trying to eliminate. They survived in ways the regime had not planned for. But what it did to them inside the prisons was something else entirely. In Phnom Penh, in a compound that had previously been a high school, the Khmer Rouge established a security facility they designated S-21. It is known today as Tuol Sleng. Between 1975 and 1979, an estimated 17,000 people were brought to Tuol Sleng. They were photographed on arrival, a bureaucratic procedure that produced one of the most haunting documentary records of any atrocity in the 20th century. Thousands of black and white photographs, men, women, children, some photographed holding number cards, some photographed in the moments after being brought in, before they understood fully where they were. Fewer than a dozen people brought to Tuol Sleng survived. The facility was run by a Khmer Rouge cadre, known as Duck, born Kaing Gwek Ava, who administered a systematic program of interrogation, torture, and execution. Prisoners were required to confess to crimes against Angkar, espionage, treason, collaboration with foreign powers, and to name other people who had participated in these fictional conspiracies. The confessions were extracted through torture. The names provided led to the arrest of more people, who were tortured into providing more names. Women were held at Tuol Sleng. Their photographs are in the archive. Survivor testimony and the documentary record from tribunal proceedings describe the specific conditions women faced inside the facility. Women were subjected to the same interrogation and torture procedures as male prisoners. They were held in cells, some individual, some communal, in conditions of deliberate deprivation. Food and water were minimal. Sexual violence against female prisoners at S-21 was documented in tribunal proceedings. Dutch himself acknowledged in court testimony that rape occurred within the facility, while attempting to frame it as individual unauthorized conduct rather than systematic policy. Survivor testimony and the accounts of former S-21 guards presented a more complex picture, one in which the boundaries between authorized and unauthorized violence were functionally meaningless within a facility where the commandant's authority was absolute. Almost every person brought to Tuol Sleng was executed. They were taken by truck to a site outside Phnom Penh called Choang Ek, one of what became known as the killing fields. They were killed and buried in mass graves. When the Khmer Rouge fell in January 1979, Vietnamese forces and journalists who entered the facility found the last prisoners, some still chained to their beds. They found the photographs. They found the confession documents. They found what the regime had left behind when it fled. Duc was arrested in 1999. He was convicted by the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia in 2010, 31 years after the facility he commanded was liberated, and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in custody in September 2020. The women in the photographs at Tuol Sleng have names. Researchers and survivors have spent decades trying to identify them. Many have not been identified yet. Of all the specific crimes committed against women during the Khmer Rouge period, forced marriage occupies a particular place in the legal and historical record. Not because it was the most violent, but because it was the most deliberate, the most systematically organized, and the longest to receive formal legal recognition as the crime it was. The Khmer Rouge required marriage. The regime had specific reasons for this that were rooted in its ideological framework. Marriage, state-controlled, arranged by Angkar, conducted in mass ceremonies, served multiple functions simultaneously. It produced new workers and soldiers for the revolution. It destroyed the old family structures that the regime was attempting to erase, and it gave Angkar control over the most intimate dimension of human life, a control that reinforced the totality of its authority over everything else. Mass wedding ceremonies were organized across cooperatives throughout the country. Groups of couples, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, were assembled in public spaces and told they were to be married. In most cases, the couples had not met before the ceremony. They were matched by cooperative leadership or by Angkar cadres who applied criteria that had nothing to do with the individuals involved. Women who refused were told they were enemies of Angkar. In documented cases, women who refused or showed resistance were executed on the spot or shortly afterward. The execution of a woman who refused to participate in a forced marriage was understood by everyone present as a demonstration of what refusal cost, and functioned as coercion for every other woman observing it. Women who complied, who stood in these ceremonies and were declared married to strangers, were then required to consummate the marriage. Refusal at this stage also carried consequences. Survivor testimony recorded in tribunal proceedings describes women being threatened, beaten, and raped by husbands they had been assigned hours earlier, with Khmer Rouge cadres aware of and in some cases present during what occurred. The psychological dimensions of this extended far beyond the ceremonies themselves. Women who had been forcibly married to strangers, and who had in some cases been forced to have children with those strangers, faced acute and specific trauma after the regime fell in 1979. They were legally married to men they had not chosen. In some cases, those men had been perpetrators of other crimes. In some cases, those men were dead. In some cases, the women had no record of who those men were because no documentation had been kept. The extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia addressed forced marriage in the case against senior Khmer Rouge leaders Nuon Chea and Khieu Samphan, the regime's second-in-command and its head of state. In 2016, 41 years after the forced marriages began, the tribunal ruled that forced marriage as practiced by the Khmer Rouge constituted a crime against humanity. It was the first time in the history of international criminal law that forced marriage had been prosecuted and convicted as a standalone crime against humanity. The ruling mattered. The women who had been waiting for it since 1979 were, by 2016, in their 60s and 70s. Some had not lived to see it. Vietnamese forces crossed into Cambodia on December 25, 1978. Phnom Penh fell on January 7, 1979. The Khmer Rouge, which had spent 4 years attempting to seal Cambodia from the outside world, fled west toward the Thai border. Pol Pot, the regime's leader, escaped. Senior cadres escaped. The organization that had killed 1 in 4 Cambodians retreated into jungle territory along the Thai-Cambodian border and continued to exist as an armed faction for nearly 2 more decades. The international response to this was not what survivors expected. Because Vietnam, a communist country that had just invaded another country, was considered by the United States, China, and much of the Western world to be the primary problem in the region, the Khmer Rouge retained Cambodia's seat at the United Nations until 1993. A government in exile that included Khmer Rouge representation was diplomatically recognized by numerous countries, while the regime's survivors were still burying their dead inside Cambodia. This was not a footnote. It shaped everything that followed. The absence of immediate international accountability allowed Khmer Rouge leadership to operate with relative freedom for years. It delayed the establishment of any legal mechanism. It meant that survivors, including the women who had endured forced marriage, forced labor, imprisonment, and sexual violence, returned to a country with no functioning legal system, no medical infrastructure, no educational institutions, and no framework for addressing what had happened to them. The Cambodian economy and social structure had been essentially destroyed. Women who emerged from the cooperative system in 1979 faced the reconstruction of their entire lives from nothing, in a country that was itself starting from nothing, while carrying trauma that had no name, no treatment, and no institutional acknowledgement. The Khmer Rouge's rank and file, the teenagers who had carried out the evacuations, operated the cooperatives, staffed the prisons, and performed the executions, returned in many cases to the villages and communities where they had grown up. They became farmers, market traders, local officials. They lived alongside survivors. In many documented cases, they lived alongside the specific people they had harmed. This created a social environment in post-war Cambodia that survivors described consistently in testimony collected by researchers and the tribunal, a permanent, unresolved proximity to perpetrators who had never been held accountable and who, in many cases, held positions of local authority. Women who had been forcibly married, imprisoned, or subjected to sexual violence navigated this environment without legal protection, without psychological support services, and without any public acknowledgement that what had happened to them was a crime rather than a feature of a difficult historical period that everyone was now expected to move past. The tribunal that might have addressed this did not begin until 2006, 27 years after the regime fell. The extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, commonly called the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, was established through an agreement between the Cambodian government and the United Nations in 2003. It began operating in 2006. By that point, Pol Pot was already dead. He had died in 1998, in a jungle camp near the Thai border, under circumstances that remain partially disputed, without ever facing a single day of legal proceedings, for the deaths of up to 2 million people. The tribunal's first conviction came in 2010, the case against Duksh, the commandant of Tuol Sleng. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in custody in September 2020. In 2014, the tribunal convicted Nuon Chea, the regime's second-in-command, and Khieu Samphan, its head of state, of crimes against humanity. In 2016, in a second case, both were additionally convicted of genocide against the Vietnamese and Cham Muslim minorities, and of the crime against humanity of forced marriage. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment. Nuon Chea died in detention in August 2019. Khieu Samphan, now in his 90s, remains in custody as of 2024, with ongoing appeal proceedings. The tribunal has been criticized consistently and from multiple directions. Survivor advocacy organizations have argued that it addressed only the most senior leadership, while the mid-level cadres who directly implemented the regime's policies, who ran the cooperatives, who organized the forced marriages, who staffed the prisons, were never prosecuted. The Cambodian government has resisted expanding the tribunal's scope, and political pressure from within Cambodia has effectively prevented additional cases from proceeding. In 2024, Cambodia under Prime Minister Hun Manet, son of former Prime Minister Hun Sen, who himself was a low-level Khmer Rouge member before defecting to Vietnam, continues to navigate the relationship between the Khmer Rouge period and contemporary political life. Hun Sen governed Cambodia for nearly 4 decades before transferring power to his son in 2023. His own history as a former Khmer Rouge member and his consistent resistance to expanding tribunal prosecutions shaped the entire post-war accountability framework. The women who survived forced marriage, S21, the cooperatives, and the killing fields era are in their 60s, 70s, and 80s in 2024. The documentation of their experiences, through the tribunal record, through academic research, through organizations like the Documentation Center of Cambodia, represents the primary historical record of what the regime did. And that record is still being built, because some of the women who could contribute to it are only now, after decades of silence enforced by trauma, stigma, and a social environment in which perpetrators remained neighbors, beginning to speak. The photographs taken at Tuol Sleng on prisoner intake are stored in an archive at the Genocide Museum in Phnom Penh. Thousands of them. Women, men, children. Photographed in the moments after their arrival at a facility where almost no one survived. Researchers have spent decades attempting to identify the people in those photographs. Family members have walked through the museum and recognized faces. Names have been attached to numbers. Histories have been partially reconstructed from the fragments that survived a regime that tried to erase everything. Some of the women in those photographs have been identified. Many have not. In 2024, the Extraordinary Chambers in the Courts of Cambodia continues its work, slowly, with limited funding, and with a survivor population that grows older and smaller every year. The mid-level cadres who ran the cooperatives, organized the forced marriages, and staffed the prisons have not been prosecuted. Most of them are still alive. Some of them live in the same villages as the women they harmed. And in Cambodia, there is still no national policy requiring schools to teach this history. Some Cambodian children grow up not knowing what happened in their own country between 1975 and 1979. The women who lived through it are still deciding whether anyone is listening carefully enough to be worth telling.